All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. James Gilly, and this is American National Government. This is our second lecture concerning federalism. So this week we're going to be, right, in this module, we're going to be examining uh, the characteristics of federalism, which are kind of the undergirding principles of the U.S. government. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. So to begin with, what we need to realize is that there is a difference in the national, right, the U.S. national understanding of federalism and the international global understanding of federalism. So this difference really heavily emerges when we think about, right, the directionality of federalism, right? What direction we are seeking to establish. So if we remember from our last module, right, the way that history kind of unfolded, right, in the United States, we were very much concerned, right, first and foremost, with preventing tyranny, right, with preventing centralization of power. But in the aftermath of, right, Shays' Rebellion, kind of the waning days of the Articles of Confederation, the big concern was actually providing more power to the central government, right, to the main government that governed everyone within the nation. So what this has led to is a difference in the way that we use the term federal in the United States, right? Within the United States, right, when we say federal or federalist, right, we're talking about this tendency to give more power to the center, right? Whereas everywhere else in the world, they're actually starting from this principle that power was concentrated in the center and they needed to disparate, right, give it to devolved halls of power, right, give it to smaller political entities, right, more local political entities. So in the U.S., when we're talking federalism, right, we're talking about this tendency to centralize, right? When we talk about the federal government, we're talking about the central government. Everywhere else in the world, right, this federalist tendency is actually to pull power away from the central state and give it to the various assorted, localized governments, right? So if we were to try to get an overall definition of federalism, right, what we'll be dealing with is a division of power between local and centralized governments, right? And this is going to be defined by some sort of governing document like a constitution. So under this federal idea, right, this federalist idea, what's attempting to be done is, right, a division of power between a local government and a centralized government. And in doing this, right, in crafting a constitution that divides up power, it's also this notion that you want to guarantee certain rights to every member of the civilization, right, of the government. And I apologize, it sounds like the neighbor is right, weed whacking, but it looks like he is just about wrapped up. So my apologies there. I'm going to let him finish real quick. Sorry. And when I go to edit this out, I'm gonna chop this part off. Just right, this little waiting here. So again, apologies for that. Right. So the idea is that there are certain rights guaranteed to everyone within the system. Right. This is going to be granted within the constitutional powers as well. And in the United States, the way that we choose to do this, right, is we actually delineate the powers that exist for the central government, right, for the what we call the federal government, right. There's certain political powers that are granted there, and everything else is reserved to either the states or the people respectively, right. That's how the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, right, really clarified the way that this power should be distributed, right? So when it comes down to federalism, right, the best definition we're going to work with is that it's a division of power between a local and centralized governments defined by a constitution where we're going to guarantee rights for everyone, and, right, we're going to keep power, especially in the United States, reserved some for the central government, but everything else, if it's not written in the Constitution, it's granted to the states or the people respectively. Now, in understanding federalism, right, there's been a series of developments over the course of the development of the United States. So over the last 250 or so years, right, the way that we have viewed federalism, the way that we interpret federalism has changed. And it's changed and ebbed and flowed between this idea of more power to the federal government, more power to the state's government, or them staying in their lane. So what we need to understand is that there are several different ways of looking at and interpreting federalism. So kind of the original, the most pure way of looking at federalism would be this notion of a dual federalism, right? This kind of dual federalism. So what this means, under its dual federalist understanding, is that each entity of power, right, the central government or the state governments, right, they each have their own responsibilities, right, and they're not supposed to cross streams, right? Stay in your lane. Right? When we're talking about dual federalism, we're talking about a very stay in your lane sort of federalism. You're responsible for things only at your level, and you need to stay concerned with how to accomplish those things. Right? This is the very much an original understanding of federalism, and it still has its proponents, right? It still has its elements that occur today, right? Even all the way up until the contemporary day. But over time, the power begins to slip away from the states and is gathered by the central government, right? And we see this in our evolving understanding of how federalism works. So the kind of next big way of interpreting federalism is something called cooperative federalism. The way, right, and this is exactly what it sounds like, right? So the federal system, right, the state governments and the local governments, they actually work together in order to govern, right? They're meant to be cooperating with each other on governance issues. And we see that this works fairly well, right? That this understanding of federalism, it might be a little bit difficult to understand who's responsible for any particular occurrence, but right, there's this kind of good faith understanding that the states and the central government are going to be wanting to work together. So that's what's going on with a cooperative federalism. It's exactly what it says: state and central governments attempting to work together. Competitive federalism is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Right, in my book, right? This is where politics really begins to take hold. And so a competitive understanding of federalism starts essentially from this premise that the central government automatically has the power, and that it gets the states and the localities to end up competing against each other for both citizens and money and services to be doled out by the central government, right? By the federal government. And so this is already shifting power much more heavily towards that centralization. And right, it's almost playing all of the entities within the system below the central government off of each other, right? Making almost like a conflict-based system. But this is conflict between the different states or local entities underneath the federal system. Oh, yep. And there's that allergies. The next understanding is even more centralized, right? It's what we call permissive federalism. Under this system, the central government is extraordinarily strong. They are very strong, and they only actually allow, right? They deign to permit the states to do certain things, right? So the way you can think of that is that the power is held within the centralized national government, and they only give out little candies, little treats to the states or the localities on certain particular issues, so maybe how to distribute healthcare dollars, but not how much of the dollars are going to get or what the overall program should be. This is very prominent in the United Kingdom right now. It goes along with their notion of devolution, meaning devolving power, giving power to local entities, right? So this is the centralized government in the UK who already has all the power, doling out powers to the local governments therein. Right? So that's a much more centralized notion of federalism. And even more power to the federal government is this notion of coercive federalism. Right? Under a coercive federalism, not only is the central government, the center government, much stronger, it actually forces the rest of the entities to do what it wants via various orders, mandates, holding back funds, right? So the central government is forcing these other entities to do what it wants them to do. Kind of the big example for this is highway funding in the United States, right? The federal government withholds highway funding in order to make the states do what they want them to do. So it's a very coercive way of going about this federalist relationship. We also see kind of the emergence of something called the New Federalism, which is actually a push to give power back to the states, right? It's part of something we call the devolution revolution, because that rhymes, and people love things that rhyme. But right, this newer understanding of federalism is actually very close to the oldest understanding of federalism, where the central government actually gives power back to the states, and we get a much more equal power relationship between, right, the central government and the devolved or, right, local governments. So within this system, we see many different interpretations of how federalism should work. So let's move on a little bit and dig a little bit deeper into federalism. So one of the biggest questions that emerges, right, that we need to think about, right, that makes this particular version of understanding American politics interesting, is that we're going to think about, right, kind of alternative options for federalism, right? What could we do instead of federalism? Really, there's two major ways of breaking things up, right? The first is this notion of a unitary system, right? This is what the United Kingdom was like before the United States left it. This is what many states are still like today. France is a big example of a modern unitary system. What this means is all power is held at the central level, right? The centralized power is the way that power is done. Decisions are made at the center, and they kind of radiate out to the rest of the country. A lot of authoritarian regimes would be classified as unitary. France is unitary. There's arguments about whether the United Kingdom is unitary. But this particular system, right, this unitary system keeps all the power concentrated at the center, right? They keep it concentrated and then make decisions for the rest of the country from there. So that's kind of the one extreme, right? Keeping the power all together on the one end. And at the other extreme, we have what's known as a confederation, which is where almost all the power and sovereignty of the state is actually, and that's the larger totality state, is held in the local governments. So it's really more of a kind of loose union of states being held together by some sort of co-governance document. This is what our Articles of Confederation initially created. There's a couple of other good examples of these confederations in the world today. If you look at Switzerland, they would definitely fall under this idea of a confederation. And I think you can make a decent argument the European Union itself is a confederation. So by putting, right, on the opposite end, right, so a unitary system, all the power is at the centralized level. On a confederation, all the power is at the local level, and there's just kind of a couple of agreements that hold everything together. So those are kind of the two poles here, if you will. And what federalism does is it attempts to bridge that gap. It attempts to be kind of a compromise between a unitary system and a confederacy. So why would you want to adopt federalism as a way of governing? Well, there's a few really good reasons for this, and I've got 5 of them listed right here. The first is kind of the overall overriding political decision that our founders made, right? And that's that they wanted to check the growth of tyranny by keeping power separated, right? And when we get to the second half of this course, we're going to look exactly at how they did this. But the idea behind all of this really functions via this idea of federalism. So federalism breaks up power. It distributes power among many actors to keep, right, all the power from ending up in the hands of one person. So federalism is really good at doing that, right? And that's one reason why you would choose federalism. Another thing that federalism allows for is experimentation within institutions, right? So at the federal level, there's just one institution, but at all the different local levels, you can experiment with better ways to govern more, right, your people locally. This allows for a lot of experimentation. A good example of this federal experimentation, right, allowed by federalism, is the Nebraska legislature. Right, most of the states in this union, right, of the United States, have more than one house. They're right bicameral legislatures, but Nebraska only has one. They're a unicameral legislature. Right, there's no House of Representatives and Senate. It's just a single legislature. So that allows for kind of experimentation. Right, you can have that and it work within a federal system. Another great thing about federalism is that it allows for unity of the nation without pushing kind of a uniformity, right? So everyone can kind of have a common goal, but there can be many paths to get there, right? That's a really good thing that federalism allows for. It also allows for, right, training opportunities for future national leaders, right? It provides kind of a political pipeline of good leadership, right? So political leaders can get trained by, doing politics at a much more local level, right? State level offices, local level offices, before they jump into the big leagues for a national office. So the political parties really like to use the opportunity to train up leaders at kind of a state level before they, move on up. And for me, I think the most important thing that federalism allows for is it really keeps government a lot closer to the people, right? One of the things that comparative politics scholars have observed is that you get better performance, better outcomes, the closer government is to the people, right? So when there are local problems, it really requires local knowledge. There's not a lot of one-size-fits-all solutions for social science kind of problems. So federalism allows, right, kind of a unity of action, but at the same time, it allows the fixing of problems to occur at a much more local, closer to the people sort of level. And I think that's a really good thing that federalism does. You tie that with the ability to check the growth of tyranny by dividing power, and that's a really powerful argument for why you would choose a federal system. So, now that we've answered why federalism, let's look at some of the problems, right? Federalism itself is not necessarily the perfect system, right? Any sort of system that we look at has benefits and drawbacks, and federalism is the same as all of those. There's really two particular areas where federalism has problems. The first is that federalism, right, has disadvantages because it's not unitary enough. Right? These are some of the major problems that we see because federalism actually divides power up too much. The first is that, right, the more you divide up power, the slower politics and politicians can be, that government can be, to actually react to problems, right? If it's just a dictator, right, he can direct forces wherever he wants them to go, centrally. If there's some sort of problem, if there's a political change that needs to be made, they can make that decision much more closely when you don't have to deal with multiple levels and power is not as divided. And by dividing up power, right, that really does slow down your ability to react to political events. So whenever we talk about the fact that American government can't, right, be overly responsive, right, that it seems to act really slowly, right, that's actually an intended outcome, right? That is a feature of the Federalist system, but it does slow down the ability to react to problems that emerge. Secondly, right, by dividing up power among various political leaders, entities, groups, right, this makes it really difficult to keep elected officials accountable, because when when everyone has a little bit of power, it's really hard to point to one person and say that, no, it's your fault. So when everyone's a little bit in charge, right, when there's a whole bunch of people that are in charge, it's really hard to put the blame on one person, right? So if everybody's a little bit responsible, then nobody's actually responsible. So it makes it really difficult to keep officials accountable within the system, right? That's a big problem within federalism, especially outside of the U.S. But even within the U.S., we have this problem. We also see that federalism increases conflict, right? The more that you divide up power, the more people have some power and some stake in the game. There's going to be a lot more conflict that emerges because, right, power is not fully centralized. And along with that, the more variation that you have within the system, this is going to lead to more inefficiency in kind of policy outcomes, right? So it's going to lead to outcomes not being the most best desired system, right? Because you've got a bunch of variations in the way that things have to be done, right? This local knowledge and local problems, it does undermine the ability of kind of central politicians to get the most efficient sort of outcome. So there are distinct problems of federalism, right, that can be seen because it's not a unitary system, because it divides up power, that actually causes problems. There's also some disadvantages that we can think of that have been observed because too much central authority is given within this system. There's really two major ones that emerge on this problem, right? This category of problems, right? The first is that within the federal system, most of the time, the central government does have the ability to override local decisions, right? Especially on certain policy decisions, right? The federal government can, in fact, override local decisions, right? That's something that's emerged over time. That's a big problem, especially when there is a difference between what locals want and what the central government wants. Right? This can lead to some major political disputes and political conflict. Also, we have seen the emergence of kind of a push for unity in the system over diversity of behavior within the system. There can be, right, at the national level, big pushes towards, right, unifying as opposed to allowing diversity to flourish. This can create some major problems concerning how politics plays out as well. So there are distinct disadvantages to federalism, right, and some of them are, right, kind of the flip side of the coin of the advantages that are given from federalism. Right, so there's both benefits and drawbacks from using a federalist system. So what we really need to look at, right, at this point is how the American system itself enacts federalism. Right? What does our uniquely American federal system look like? Right? So we have divided up power between what this nation can do and what the states can do. Right? So national powers, right, the powers of the central government, right, the federal government, are very much limited by the United States Constitution. Right? So within the United States Constitution, there are certain powers that are given to the federal government. Right? The first category of these, what we call the delegated or the expressed powers. Right? These are the powers that exist within the Constitution. So these are things like Congress shall establish a judiciary. The president has authority over foreign policy. The Congress has the ability to print money. Right? These are things that are actually written out in the various articles and sections in the Constitution. Right? So these are granted. Right? Is kind of the way of thinking about it. These are powers that are granted by the people to the federal government. There's also some powers that are kind of held back or implied by the way that the Constitution is written. Right? So it's implied but never explicitly stated that the federal government has the ability to buy new land to expand the country. There's also, right, tied into the implied powers notion this idea of the necessary and proper clause, right? That the government has the ability to do all those things necessary and proper to the proper maintenance of the government and the welfare of the people. So basically that's a catch-all term for if the government needs to do it, it does have the ability to do it. And with that kind of come inherent powers. Those are the things that governments have to do, like negotiate with foreign powers or go to war to protect its people. These are inherent things that governments all have to do, be they democratic, non-democratic, right? These are the things that, right, kind of define government. And we'll talk about each of these a little bit more heavily when we talk about the institutions of the government. There's also something important called the Interstate Commerce Clause. What this Interstate Commerce Clause does says that Congress has the ability to regulate all commerce between the states and between the United States and the rest of the world. Right? So this Interstate Commerce Clause causes a lot of questions about what actually constitutes interstate commerce. But the Congress and the federal government are given large authority to govern and regulate economic activity. So that kind of falls under this Interstate Commerce Clause. And then, right, kind of tying it all together, wrapping it all up, is a Supremacy Clause, which states that the states in the system cannot ignore or substitute their own laws. Right, so the federal government, its laws, when it's right on issues that it has ultimate authority to do, right, those laws are the supreme law of the land. Right, states can't undermine federal law with their own state laws. Can you think of some examples right now of places where this Supremacy Clause might be coming into play? That might make for a good response to one of your response papers. There are issues where the federal government and the state governments don't line up. They might not line up. So when they're at cross purposes, theoretically, the federal government's laws are the supreme law of the land. But we see some major issues emerging right now over the last several years, right? Particularly gay marriage and recreational uses of marijuana. Those are kind of big issues where Supremacy Clause is coming back into play. We also see that given to the national federal government are war powers, right? Only the national government can go to war, and only the national government can make treaties and regulate trade with other states. So when it comes to external politics with other nations in the world, that's going to be held by the central government. And ultimately, taxing and spending authority is also given to the central government. This is a response to the way the Articles of Confederation were crafted. All right, the big problem with the Articles of Confederation is that they did not, in fact, have taxing and spending authority, and that made it really difficult to govern. So that was really early granted to the federal government. Now, within this system, the states themselves also have powers, right? Generally speaking, most of the power is reserved for the states. So the federal government is granted powers by the Constitution. The Constitution reserves power for the states. And there's a lot of things the states can make policy over that the federal government can't. The federal government actually is prohibited from making healthcare decisions. Right, they can create the overall system, but within that system, the states have to do the action. Right, so even under the American Care Act, right, Obamacare, the states are the primary actors in that system. And most social sort of policies come out of the states, or regulated, driven by the states. Now, there are some powers that are given to both the states and to the federal government, right? Chief among these is taxation authority. The states do have to have ways to raise revenue for themselves. So, right, really kind of these financial decisions allow for the states to make, right, we've got kind of a concurrent federal and state legal path. Additionally, there are some things that are expressly prohibited to the states, right, that the states just cannot do. First among these is states cannot make treaties with foreign governments, right? The state of Louisiana, we love, right, sending our politicians to go to Cuba from time to time, right, do some political wheeling and dealing, but there's no actual treaty allowed to be made by the states with foreign governments. We just can't do that, right? That is expressly forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. The states also cannot grant letters of marque and reprisal, so they can't authorize pirates to go out and steal people's stuff and give the goodies back to the state. That hasn't been done in a very long time, but the states never had the ability to do it. States can also not coin money, issue bills of credit, or make anything but gold and silver coins legal tender. So the state of Louisiana could craft gold and silver coins and make that legal tender, but the ability to create currency and money only belongs to Congress, right? The federal government. States also cannot tax imports and exports, right? That's a strictly federal thing, right? Louisiana couldn't issue a tariff on sugar imports from Mexico, right? Only the federal government can do that. No taxation of foreign ships can occur. Again, it's just like imports and exports. State of Louisiana can't tax foreign ships for coming into port. The states are not allowed to keep troops in times of peace, right? They can have a militia, right? That's what the National Guard is. It serves as the militia, but they're not allowed to have standing armies. Nor are states allowed to actually engage in war against foreign powers. That can only be done by the federal government. So this notion of sending the National Guard to fight wars overseas is a little bit constitutionally iffy, a little shaky on constitutional grounds, but we do it anyway because the federal government calls for the aid of the militias to fight foreign wars. Right, so they're acting through the national military. It's not the Louisiana National Guard going off and fighting Iraq on our own or fighting in Iraq on its own, right? It's part of the U.S. Forces there. Right, so there's some significant differences in what powers are granted to the central government and what powers are reserved for the state governments. So digging a little bit deeper into federalism, right? One of the key things that the federal government does that's granted to the central government is regulating relationships between the various states, right? Building up these interstate relationships. Kind of the first important thing, and this is actually a carryover from the Articles of Confederation, is this notion of the full faith and credit clause, right? What this means is that between the states, they must uphold civil judgments within other states. So if I've sued someone in a court of law in Arkansas, that will also apply in Texas and Louisiana and every other state in the Union. Now, criminal judgments can vary between state and state. And generally speaking, right, even though each state might have slightly different rights, when you're a citizen of, say, Louisiana and you go to Colorado, right? In Louisiana, it is illegal to smoke marijuana. In Denver, right, in Colorado, it's entirely legal. So if you're a Louisiana citizen, but you go to Denver, you're given the full slate of rights as a Colorado resident. Now, those actions that you do in Colorado could still be illegal in Louisiana. But when you're in Colorado, they're not illegal for you there. But, and this is really important, there is a notion of extradition, meaning that if you have committed a crime in another state or you fled to another state from which you were, right, you committed it, right, so if you murder someone in like Georgia and then you flee to Texas, they're going to send you back. You've committed a crime in another state and they can ask you to be extradited back to your home state. If you're speeding in Louisiana and you cross the border into Texas, that they can arrest you and send you back to Louisiana and give you a big ticket for that if you ran from the cops. So there is this thing of extradition between states in our country. Every state has to have an extradition agreement with every other state. So don't be committing crimes and fleeing the state. They're totally going to be able to send you back, and right, that's going to look really, really bad. So don't do that. Although that's not legal advice. That's just me talking. I'm not a lawyer, so don't take any sort of legal advice from me. There are also interstate compacts, right? Right, the various states are not allowed to go to war with each other, right? They have to settle disputes within each other without force. State of Louisiana cannot go to war with Alabama as much as we might want to, basically every year in the second week of November. Can't do that. They have to settle issues primarily without force. No force can be used between states. So generally speaking, when there are issues of questions of federalism, these are actually smoothed out by federal courts, right? It is the Supreme Court that has helped establish how federalism plays out between states and the federal government. The first example of when the Supreme Court did this, right, which really established the boundaries of our modern Federalist system, was the court case McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Right, this is the first Supreme Court case to deal with state power versus central power. And you need to know a little bit about the facts of this case in order to understand why it's so important. So at this time, right, there was a push to establish a central national bank. But, right, in the establishing of this bank, the state of Maryland taxed the creation of this bank. Right? Now, the question here is the issue of establishing and creating a bank, right? This isn't an expressed power for the central government. It doesn't say they can create banks. They can create currency, but it doesn't say anything about the creation of a bank. So the Chief Justice, right, Justice Marshall, found that there is an implied power that the federal government, right, because they are given the ability to regulate commerce, they can create a bank, right? It's implied by the Constitution that they had this power. So in doing that, right, they created this notion, right, this finding of national supremacy. So when there is a conflict between federal law and state law, federal law trumps it, right? It is supreme over it. Right? It's also this, right, called this notion of preemption, right? National law overrides state and local laws. So in those states where marijuana is legal, right, it is still federally illegal. So theoretically, it is still illegal. The federal government can come in and arrest you if you open a dispensary in Colorado or Nevada. All right, it's still a federal crime, right? And you can't participate in federal banking and all sorts of things like that. So there's some major differences between, right, federal law, state law, and when there is a difference between federal and state law, federal law overrides it, right, trumps it, is supreme, right, preempts the local law. Now, thinking about the relationship between the Supreme Court and Congress is also really important in how this federal system plays out, especially when it comes to that interstate commerce clause. And if we look at the way the Commerce Clause has been applied from 1937 to today, what we see is that it essentially gives Congress the ability to regulate anything in economics how they see fit. In 1937, there was a particular case about a farmer growing wheat on his own farm, right? Now he grew more, right? There was a federal law. Congress had mandated that there was only so much wheat that any particular farmer could grow, right, and be able to sell into the system. Now, this farmer grew extra wheat to tuck back and save for himself for his own personal use. Now, the court case tried to decide whether or not, because that wheat could theoretically enter into interstate commerce, whether or not that constituted a violation of this interstate commerce clause, right? A violation of the law that Congress wrote. And what the Supreme Court found is that, yes, if it could theoretically enter into interstate commerce, then it's regulatable, right? That the Congress can regulate. The federal law applies more heavily. So what we've seen is that, right, this has really given Congress a lot of authority, and this was backed up in findings about Obamacare and other, right, economic issues since 1937. So this is the law of the land. Congress has a lot of ability to influence the economy since this finding. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been pushes, right, and changes in the politics about federalism, right? Federalism is the original political issue in the United States, right? With the creation of the Constitution, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were the original political players in this country. And these issues still undergird a lot of our political battles in this country. So what we see is really two major tensions, right? On the one hand, we have these centralists, right? And what they believe is that the Constitution doesn't exist as an interstate agreement, right? What the Constitution is the supreme law of the people, right? It gives the power of the states, right? And power is only denied when the Constitution explicitly limits it, right? And the reason behind this is that the Constitution represents the entirety of the people, and the best way to represent the people is via this national government, right? Having the national government be supreme and states only because states only represent some of the people within the system, right? So the national government represents everyone, and that's why it should have the most power within the system, right? The easiest way to represent everyone and to make sure everyone has rights is to keep the power at the centralized system, right? Only the states right? The states only represent some of their people. The federal government represents everyone, right? So this centralizing tendency is a political view that really wants to push forward and get things done, right? Accomplish things at a national level. And there is a large centralist tendency in both the Republican and Democratic parties right now, and really has been for the last 100 years or so. On the other hand, there are the decentralists, those who want to distribute power back to the states and the local people, right? They believe that the Constitution is simply a agreement between the states in order to limit central authority, right? Right, that all power in the system should be very narrowly defined. And that the states themselves, because they are closer to the people, that's the ones that should be sovereign, right? It should be the state itself that's sovereign, not the federal government, because the states are much closer to the people. And another consequence of that is that of this worldview is that the central government must only interfere very narrowly with states' actions. So it's almost the exact opposite of centralism, right? The states should be the primary actors with only very narrow interference from the national government. And for decentralists, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is really the key to their understanding, right? This 10th Amendment states that if a power in the Constitution is not granted to the central government, then it is reserved for the states and the people thereby, right? So this is meant to keep power and decision making at a much more local level, right? And let people do what they wish within kind of the boundaries laid out by the Constitution. So these different views on the Constitution really drive a lot of the politics within the United States. Now, the way that these Federalist politics play out, right, this centralist versus decentralist debate, right, the way that the actual federalism gets enacted is typically via the budget, right? Really, most of our federal politics plays out because of budgetary concerns, right? The budget is used to direct how the states and the federal government interact with each other. And for the most part, most of this power is held by the central government, right? They control most of the budgetary power and give out money via grants to the states. There's really 4 major categories of grants that the federal government uses to enact its federalism. The first is what we call a project grant, which is for a specific purpose, typically has some sort of competitive process attached to it, right? So this is money held by the federal government, says, hey, if you're trying to, we got some projects we want you to do, right? We want you to make educational standards better. So you states, you compete for money, and we'll give you money if it looks like you're going to compete well within this system, right? That you're going to carry out our project in the best way. Secondly, we have what are called formula grants, right? And these are, this is money that is granted to the states based on some specific formula, usually attached to population statistics. So, right, a formula grant just doled out to the states based on like math of how the population's built up. Categorical grants also have a specific purpose, and this is money that's given with very specific strings attached. Like, so we'll give you money for for building highways, only if you raise your drinking age to 21. Right? That's a big example of a categorical grant. We also see block grants, right? These block grants are just kind of general money given by the government for assistance. So this is your healthcare block of money. This is your, right, that's kind of the main one, is healthcare. Here's some Social Security money we're going to throw at you, right? So it's just a big block of money. Think of it as a big block of cheese that gets doled out by the federal government. Now, we have also seen over the development of the last several hundred years a big swing back and forth in where the center of power is located. So part of this is that really this truly central federal government really gets established during the Civil War by Lincoln, right? So the first about 100 years of our government, right, power was really heavily distributed to the states. It's only during the Central War that it becomes very centralized. And right in the intervening years, right, we see more and more power, right, flow towards that centralized government, right, really solidify its grip on power, right. During the populist era, from the 1880s to the 1920s, we see more and more powers granted to the central federal government. Among those is the income tax, right. The income tax is used to help fund World War I. Right, our activities in World War I, and it never goes away, right? That power never goes away. The federal government now has the ability to tax how much money you make, and they hold on to that. And as the economy grows and booms after the Second World War, and their government's raking in all this income tax money, they start to do more and more things, right? So the government becomes more services based, right? It accomplishes more and more things in everyone's everyday life. And this really grows the size and scope of government. And it's only once we get to the financial crisis of 2008 that people begin to question whether that government growth is a good thing, whether the government can really sustain this growth, right? And what it does. And maybe there starts to be a swing back towards a smaller, kind of lean, a government that does less, but does less better, right? Does fewer things. But with kind of the politics today, right, current contemporary politics here in 2019 or so, that idea about shrinking the size and scope of government is pretty much gone. What we've now seen, right, as of February 2019, is the largest federal deficit of all time, and the government's doing all sorts of things, and we've got people on both sides of the aisle pushing for the government to do more and more. So it seems like the central government is going to be very important moving forward. Now, just to give you an idea of a few of these federal programs, right? Federal, right, meaning these central programs that are actually enacted by the states. Right, 4 big examples of this, right? The school lunch program, right? The federal government has ideas about how school lunches should be done and funded, but it's the states themselves that actually enact it. Oops, let's go back up. Right, the federal government itself actually is what enacts, right? Gives this money to the states, and then the states are the ones that actually implement the school lunch program. Same thing with highway funding. The federal government doesn't have the ability to build roads across the country, but they have the ability to give funds and allocate funds to the states for that road building. When it comes to security and identification, right, there is no national ID. The closest thing we have is a passport. But there's been pushes since September 11, 2001 to find ways for the people within the United States to have, right, kind of a centralized database of who they are and be able to identify and verify themselves. And we've seen the emergence of the real ID. If you've gone and gotten your driver's license renewed recently, you have the option to now have a real ID. And each state has its own capacity to feed into this system to create a secure real ID. And without a real ID, you can't, right, use your driver's license to get on a plane. You're going to have to use a passport for that. So real ID is a federal push for a national ID that relies heavily on the states to enact it. And also, right, health insurance, right? We've already talked about that. The federal government can't provide health insurance, right? Even Medicare and Medicaid are administered through the states. So the federal government can set up a program, but it has to be enacted by the states. So there are many different things that federalism does. Right? Federalism is the key concept that our national government, right, the way that the United States functions. So the politics of federalism and federalism as a whole are vastly important. So what we're going to move on to next, right, our next module, is going to look at how federalism got enacted via the Constitution, right? This idea of a constitutional republic and the Constitution itself, what does it do? Why do we have a Constitution? What do constitutions themselves do? And why is our Constitution kind of exceptional and unique within the international system? So That's going to wrap it up. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, queries, quandaries, quibbles, or conundrums, please feel free to send me a message on Discord, shoot me an email, get into contact with me. I'm very much willing to clear that up. So I'm going to bid you all a good evening, and thank you for watching.